Just at that moment, the silence of the office was broken by the faintest of noises, a soft shuffle at the door. Laura barely had time to react before the door was kicked open with a violent crash. Her heart leapt into her throat as masked figures in black tactical gear flooded the room. Before she could even reach for her weapon, they were on her, grabbing her by the arms, pinning her to the desk. "What the hell?" she gasped, trying to fight back. But the men were too strong. One of them clamped a hand over her mouth, muffling her scream. Fear surged through her as she realized the gravity of the situation. These weren't random attackers. These were professionals. They had known exactly where to find her. She had been compromised. Her mind raced for a way out, but her thoughts were scattered, too slow. She felt a cold chill run down her spine as the men began to drag her toward the door. This was it. This was the end. But just as quickly as they had appeared, there was a sudden flurry of movement. A loud crash, followed by gunfire. The men holding her faltered for a split second, and that was all the opening she needed. She broke free from their grasp, throwing herself to the side as the room erupted into chaos. Blake's voice rang out above the confusion. "Wells, get down." She ducked instinctively, the sound of gunfire ringing in her ears as Blake and his team rushed into the room, weapons drawn, taking down the masked men one by one. Laura watched, her breath shallow, her pulse pounding in her ears, as Blake worked with a cold efficiency that only came from years of experience. The men were pinned to the ground, incapacitated, but not before they had managed to make their move. Blake quickly made his way over to Laura, pulling her to her feet. His face was grim, his eyes scanning the room, alert to any more threats. He was sweating, his breath coming in short bursts, but there was no time for panic now. Not with everything on the line. "Laura, are you okay?" Blake asked, his voice low but urgent. His grip on her arm tightened, as if afraid she would slip away. I think so," she said, her voice shaky. Her mind was still trying to catch up with the chaos unfolding around her. "I don't understand. Who are they? Why now?" Blake gave her a quick, tight-lipped smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "They were after you. And everything you've been working on. It's no coincidence that they came for you right when you were getting too close to the truth." Laura looked around, her thoughts spiraling. "The governor," she murmured, almost to herself. "Her name, it was on the document. That's why they came for me." Blake nodded, his face hardening. "That's why they want you out of the picture. Whatever you've uncovered, it's big. And it's getting too close to the top." Laura's heart sank as she realized the depth of what she was dealing with. "But if they're trying to shut me down, then they're already onto me. They know what I'm doing." "Not if we disappear," Blake said quickly. He grabbed her by the shoulders, turning her to face him. His expression was deadly serious. "We can't keep going at this pace. We're going to have to go dark. Lay low. The sting operation's the only way." Laura shook her head, her mind still spinning. "A sting operation? How can we even get close to them? They've got power, connections everywhere." Blake's jaw tightened. "That's exactly why we need to work from the shadows. We'll be a step ahead. Get inside their system, play their game. But we'll do it from a place they can't find us. No one can know what we're planning, not even the people closest to us. But how will we know who's on our side? How will we know who to trust?" Laura's voice cracked, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. Blake paused, his eyes searching hers for a moment. "We'll trust each other," he said, his voice resolute. "We don't have a choice." The words hung in the air for a moment, thick with tension. Laura felt a strange calm settle over her. She knew Blake wasn't wrong. They didn't have time for second-guessing. It was either sink or swim. Blake grabbed a set of keys from his pocket and tossed them to Laura. "We've got a safe house lined up. It's off the grid. No one knows about it. We're going underground, Laura. No more phone calls, no more meetings. Just us, the files, and our plan. It's the only way to survive." Laura caught the keys, her fingers still trembling from the close call. She knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw a way forward, a way to fight back. "Let's do it," she said, her voice steady now. "Let's take them down." Blake nodded, the weight of the plan settling over both of them. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. This was about survival. And revenge. As they moved quickly out of the office, Laura's heart pounded with the realization that the game had changed. It was no longer just about solving a case. It was about taking down a system that had been built to keep the truth buried and the people in power untouchable. They had been given a glimpse of the truth, and now they had no choice but to follow the thread, no matter where it led. Blake and Laura had always been different, but together, they made sense. It had been weeks since they had first descended into the shadows, leaving behind the world of light and public scrutiny. Their days had been consumed by the intricate details of a case, the kind that no one dared to touch, buried deep within the underground networks. They had each other, and in this confined, secretive world, that was all they needed. At first, Blake had been hesitant. He wasn't one to stay in the shadows, not like this. But when Laura had reached out to him, her calm and persistent nature breaking through his walls, he had known she was the only one who could make sense of what was unraveling. Together, they dove deeper into the mysteries surrounding the case, piecing together threads no one else could see. The dark underground world became their sanctuary. Laura, always meticulous and patient, led the charge. She had always been drawn to the deeper corners of life, hidden truths, obscure facts, things most people ignored. She had a sharp mind, one that could cut through layers of deception like a scalpel. Blake admired that about her, and as the days passed, his respect for her grew. He had always prided himself on his ability to solve problems, but working alongside her had opened his eyes to a new way of thinking. She was methodical, while he was impulsive. Together, they made the perfect team. In the darkness of their hidden office, surrounded by piles of old files, discarded documents, and the constant hum of old computers, they worked in silence most of the time. Their connection was palpable, but they didn't speak about it often. The case came first. Their every waking moment was consumed by the need to understand it, to solve it. There was something exhilarating about their late-night sessions. The world outside slept, unaware of the quiet revolution they were starting. Every morning, they walked out of their dimly lit office, tired but with a growing sense of accomplishment. They had uncovered so much already, connections, names, events that had been brushed aside by the powers that be. Slowly, Blake began to see that this was more than just a case. It was a battle, one that no one was willing to fight except for the two of them. And in that battle, something else had been growing. Something neither of them had expected. One evening, after a long stretch of analyzing data and cross-referencing documents, Blake leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his messy hair. "Laura, how did we get here? I mean, it feels like we've been down here forever." Laura didn't look up from her screen. She had that look on her face, the one that told Blake she was deep in thought, piecing together something important. "Time works differently down here," she said softly, her voice low and comforting. "The world above is so far away. I don't know if it even matters anymore." Her words hung in the air for a moment before Blake spoke again. "It matters to me," he said, his voice gentle but earnest. Laura turned to face him then, her eyes meeting his with a look that said everything. There was no need for further words. She understood. In the weeks that followed, the intensity of their work became an anchor for them both. They began to find new ways to communicate. It wasn't just the case they discussed, it was everything. The way Blake would make her laugh with a quick, dry comment, or the way Laura would guide him through a difficult problem, her patience always steady. They had become more than colleagues, more than partners. They were becoming something else, something neither of them could deny. One evening, as they sat together, huddled over a map of old city streets, Blake reached out and brushed his hand against hers. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt monumental. Laura looked at him, her expression softening. They didn't speak for a long time, but the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was full of meaning, a shared understanding that ran deeper than any words could capture. As the days turned into weeks, the case became more complicated. The deeper they dug, the more they realized how interconnected everything was, how their own lives were becoming part of the puzzle. They had found things that made them question the very people they had once trusted. There were times when it seemed as though they were up against forces that were too powerful to fight. But no matter the odds, they pressed on, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. And it wasn't just the case that was changing them. It was each other. They began to rely on each other more than ever before. Blake had always been independent, but in the shadows, he found solace in Laura's presence. She grounded him, kept him focused when everything seemed to spiral out of control. And for Laura, Blake was her anchor. His fierce determination, his quick thinking, and his unwavering loyalty gave her the strength she needed to keep going. There was a night, late into their investigation, when Blake finally spoke the words that had been lingering on the tip of his tongue for weeks. He had come to understand something profound about their connection, something that transcended the case and everything they had been working toward. "You know," he began, his voice quiet, "I don't think I've ever met anyone like you before, Laura." She looked up from the papers in front of her, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" Blake shifted in his chair, his gaze never leaving hers. "I mean, I don't think I've ever felt this way about anyone. Not in the way I feel about you." Laura's heart skipped a beat. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made Blake's chest tighten. He hadn't expected to say those words out loud, but once they were out, they felt like the most natural thing in the world. From that moment on, their relationship deepened. The case still loomed over them, but now it wasn't the only thing they focused on. Their connection became the center of their world. When they were together, it didn't matter that they were working in secrecy, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and deception. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. Days turned into weeks, and their bond grew unbreakable. The work they were doing was important, but it was the strength of their love that gave them the power to keep pushing forward. Together, they would face whatever came next, because, in the end, they knew that nothing could tear them apart. Governor Elena Rivers sat at her mahogany desk, hands pressed tightly against the surface, as her mind raced through the impending disaster. She had spent years meticulously building her political empire, shaping the state's policies, and creating a narrative that favored her party. But now, after 2 tumultuous election cycles, it was all slipping away. She had done everything in her power to keep the reins of government tightly in her grasp, but it wasn't enough. The opposition party had gained an unprecedented amount of traction. Its candidate, Thomas Green, was everything she wasn't: charismatic, relatable, and fiercely determined. The polls were clear. Green was winning. His platform had struck a chord with the people, addressing issues that her administration had long neglected. His ability to connect with voters, to speak to their needs, was undeniable. His momentum was unstoppable. If the election were held today, it was almost certain that he would claim victory. Elena clenched her fists, her jaw tightening. She couldn't allow this to happen. Losing the election wasn't just a blow to her. It would be the end of everything she had built, everything she had fought for. Her party would crumble, her legacy would be erased, and the power she had so carefully cultivated would slip through her fingers. No, she couldn't let it come to that. She would do whatever it took to retain control. Her mind drifted to the last 2 elections, elections that had been marred by accusations of voter fraud. The whispers had started small, but as time went on, the evidence had become undeniable. Manipulated voting machines, mysterious ballot boxes, and widespread irregularities. But in the end, it had been enough to quell the opposition's protests. The results had been accepted, but only because the damage hadn't been catastrophic. This time, however, the stakes were much higher. The margin of victory would be too large to simply amend. There would be no room for error. And then there was Dr. Elias Stevens. The brilliant but controversial scientist had been one of the governor's most trusted allies in the shadows, providing her with the kind of edge she needed in a world where power was often won and lost in the hidden corners of society. Dr. Stevens had been working on a project that could ensure the party's continued dominance, a system designed to subtly influence voter behavior. His research was revolutionary, the kind of technology that could tip the scales in her favor without anyone ever knowing. But then came the unthinkable. Dr. Stevens was dead. The news had hit like a bombshell. He had been found in his private lab, a victim of what appeared to be a tragic accident, though the details were still murky. Elena had instructed her staff to keep a lid on the story, but the damage was done. Dr. Stevens' sudden death had left a hole in her plans that seemed impossible to fill. Without his expertise, the delicate mechanisms of influence he had been developing were lost. Blake and Laura, the two investigators who had been closing in on the truth, were a growing nightmare. Their tireless pursuit of the case had started to gain traction. They had discovered the ties between Stevens and the governor's office, and their investigation was nearing a breaking point. Blake, with his razor-sharp intellect, and Laura, with her determination and uncanny ability to dig deeper than anyone else, were the last thing Elena needed right now. If they uncovered the full extent of what had been happening in the shadows, it would all be over. She stared at the framed picture of her late father on the wall, her father, who had taught her that power was everything. Power was the difference between success and failure. Power was what allowed you to reshape the world. But the power she had worked so hard to maintain was now slipping away, and with it, her grip on reality. Governor, her chief of staff, James McAllister, interrupted her thoughts as he entered the room. His face was tight with anxiety, and he quickly closed the door behind him. "Is it done?" she asked, her voice low but controlled. She couldn't afford to show any weakness now. James nodded, but there was an unease in his eyes. "Stephen's death has caused an uproar. The media is starting to pick up on the inconsistencies, and Blake and Laura are closer than ever. They're starting to put the pieces together, and they're getting too close for comfort." Elena's gaze hardened, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. She had anticipated some fallout, but the speed with which things were escalating caught her off guard. Blake and Laura were relentless, and now they were uncovering things that shouldn't have been found. "What are they after now?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Dr. Stevens," James replied grimly. "They're digging into his work, his connections to the party, to the election manipulations. It won't be long before they make the link. They've already started interviewing people who worked with him. If they dig deep enough, they'll find the blueprint. They'll know everything." Elena's mind raced. There had to be something she could do. She couldn't let this unravel now, not when everything was so close. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her as she considered her options. There was only one thing left to do. One final, desperate measure to maintain control. "Contact the network," she said suddenly, her voice filled with cold determination. "I need the signal to go out. It's time." James looked at her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "Governor, are you sure?" There is no other choice," she cut him off. "We need to secure the election, or everything will be lost. If Blake and Laura are allowed to continue, they'll destroy us all. I won't let that happen." James hesitated, but only for a moment. He knew the risks, but he also knew the stakes. If she wasn't going to back down, neither could he. "Understood, Governor. I'll make the call." As he left the room, Elena took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the last trick in her book. It wasn't just about winning the election anymore. It was about survival. She had always prided herself on being able to control the narrative, to shape the outcome of events. But now, the narrative had taken on a life of its own. And Blake and Laura? They were going to be the ones who would tear it all apart if she didn't act. She rose from her desk, her resolve hardening. The collapse of the opposition was inevitable. She just had to make sure the collapse of her own empire didn't come next. The final chapter of this battle was about to be written, and Elena Rivers was determined to be the one holding the pen. Laura sat at her desk, staring at the cryptic message on her phone. "I won't say much. Come to Guatemala City at the same hotel." No name. No context. But Laura knew who it had to be, Aaron. It had been weeks since she last heard from her. Their last case had left more questions than answers, but she was sure Aaron had finally uncovered something important. Laura wasted no time and called Blake. He didn't hesitate. They had to go. The flight to Guatemala City was a tense one. Laura kept her eyes on her phone, half expecting another message, some kind of clarification. But nothing came. Blake, ever the rational one, tried to assure her. If Aaron sent this, she must have a reason for being cryptic, he said. She better, Laura muttered, her fingers tapping anxiously on the armrest. After arriving, they checked into the same hotel where Aaron had stayed before. Every hallway, every corner, every glance from a stranger sent a shiver down Laura's spine. It was too quiet, too normal. And yet, she felt anything but. They waited in their room, the minutes stretching into hours. Then, at exactly 11 p.m., there was a knock. Not a hesitant one, not a loud one, just 3 steady taps. Laura and Blake exchanged a glance before inching toward the door. Laura's hand hovered over the knob before she took a deep breath and yanked it open. The moment she saw the figure standing before her, her breath caught in her throat. Blake, usually composed, stood frozen beside her. Neither of them screamed. They couldn't. Their minds refused to process what they were seeing. Dr. Elias Stevens, the man who had been declared dead. He looked at them with an amused expression, taking in their wide-eyed shock. Then, in a calm, almost casual voice, he said, "No, I'm not a ghost, Laura. I'm very much alive." Laura's body remained still, her mind racing. Fear wrapped around her like ice, making it impossible to move. The rational part of her brain screamed that this was impossible. The rest of her was too overwhelmed to think. Dr. Stevens stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He gave them a moment to recover, but their shock held them in place. Finally, Laura managed to find her voice. "How?" she breathed. "How are you alive?" Dr. Stevens sighed and folded his arms. "You didn't arrest me, Laura," he said. "It was my double that you got. I tricked both you and the system." The words took a moment to settle in. Laura's mind replayed the investigation, the evidence, the arrest. How had they not seen it? "There's more to this than you think," he continued. "I was in prison in all my success. From the outside, I was this well-respected figure, admired, powerful. But inside, I was trapped." Blake, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, filled with disbelief. "So what? You're saying you let us take down your double?" "Why?" Dr. Stevens smirked. "Because, Blake, your investigation freed me. I had to trick both you and the system to gain freedom." Laura felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. Nothing made sense anymore. All their work, all their efforts, had they been playing into his hands the entire time? "I owe you," Dr. Stevens said, his voice turning serious. "And now I need to pay you back." Laura narrowed her eyes. "Pay us back," she repeated. "For what?" Dr. Stevens stepped forward, his expression deadly serious. "To save our state." Silence hung in the air. The weight of his words pressed down on them. "I will help you, Laura." The room felt smaller, the world darker. Everything they thought they knew had just shattered. And now they had a choice to make. Dr. Elias Stevens leaned forward, his piercing gaze locked onto Laura as the dim hotel light cast long shadows on the walls. Blake sat beside her, arms crossed, still processing the shocking revelation that the man they thought was long gone was very much alive. "Let me start with the strategy," Dr. Stevens said, his voice steady yet urgent. "What you know, Laura, is just the tip of the iceberg. This goes way beyond politics, but mobilizing the right people, powerful figures who can influence the system, is the only way to put an end to this." Laura narrowed her eyes, her investigative instincts kicking in. "Mobilize how? And for what exactly?" Dr. Stevens leaned back, exhaling as if he were about to unload a truth he had kept hidden for too long. "You are chasing corruption, but the corruption you exposed was merely a decoy. The real players, the ones pulling the strings, are invisible. They operate like a shadow government, controlling everything from behind the scenes. And now that they know you're getting close, they'll do anything to silence you." Blake finally spoke, his skepticism evident. "And you? You faked your own arrest and death? Why should we trust you now?" Dr. Stevens smirked. Because I have no choice but to tell you the truth. If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't be here talking to you, would I? Silence filled the room as Laura considered his words. All right, she said cautiously. What's the next step? Dr. Stevens sat forward again, his voice lowering. As an investigator, politics is not your jurisdiction, Laura. But your expertise will be invaluable. We need to get hold of Thomas Green, the opposition candidate for state governor. He has influence, and most importantly, he's one of the few politicians who isn't bought. If we can get him on our side, we stand a chance. Laura raised an eyebrow. And you think Green will believe us? That he'll mobilize his people based on what? Your word? Dr. Stevens shook his head. Not just my word. Evidence. Blake frowned. What kind of evidence? Dr. Stevens reached into his coat and pulled out a flash drive. Everything. Documents, recordings, financial transactions, names of those involved, dates, locations. Proof that the current administration is nothing but a front for a much darker force. If Green sees this, he won't just believe us. He'll have no choice but to act. Laura took the flash drive, rolling it between her fingers. This is dangerous. Of course it is, Dr. Stevens admitted. That's why we need to move fast. Once they realize this information is out, they'll come after us with everything they have. Blake exhaled sharply. So, what's the plan? We just waltz up to Green and hand him this? Dr. Stevens smirked. Not quite. Green is under heavy surveillance. If we approach him the wrong way, we'll be compromised before we even begin. We need to be smart about this. We need to play the game of minds. Laura crossed her arms. And how do we do that? Dr. Stevens leaned in, his expression serious. We outthink them. We make them believe we're doing one thing while we're actually doing another. Green has a scheduled campaign event tomorrow. His security detail will be tight, but there's a window of opportunity, a moment where we can get to him without raising suspicion. Which is? Laura asked. The fundraiser dinner after the rally, Dr. Stevens explained. There will be hundreds of people. If we disguise ourselves as part of the catering team, we can get close enough to slip him a message without tipping off his security. Blake scoffed. That's risky. What if they recognize us? Dr. Stevens smiled. That's where the real game begins. We make sure they do recognize us, but in the wrong way. Laura frowned. What do you mean? Dr. Stevens leaned back, clearly enjoying the puzzle he was laying out. We leak false intel. Let them believe we'll be meeting Green in private at another location. That way, they'll be too busy monitoring the wrong place while we get to him unnoticed at the event. Laura exchanged a look with Blake. It was a bold plan, one that could either work flawlessly or get them all killed. And what happens after we give him the information? She asked. Dr. Stevens' expression darkened. Then we see if Thomas Green is truly the man we believe him to be. If he is, we'll have an ally with real power. If he's not, well, then we'll have an even bigger problem. Laura took a deep breath. And if they find out about this before we make our move? Dr. Stevens didn't hesitate. Then we run. And we hope we're faster than they are. Blake cursed under his breath. This just keeps getting better and better. Laura clenched the flash drive in her palm. The game had begun. And now there was no turning back. Laura and Blake were moments away from stepping out of their hotel when the door swung open. Standing there, in the dim hallway, was Aaron. For a few seconds, neither Laura nor Blake could process what they were seeing. Their minds struggled to reconcile the image in front of them with what they knew, what they believed. Aaron. Laura finally managed, her voice thick with disbelief. What are you doing here? Blake, still frozen, blinked hard, as if he expected her to disappear. Aaron smirked, her arms crossed. Surprise? Before Laura could react, a figure stepped up beside Aaron. Dr. Elias Stevens. Aaron, you didn't tell them you were with me here? Dr. Stevens asked, arching an eyebrow. Aaron shrugged. I wanted you to do your thing. I didn't want to interrupt your game. Blake finally snapped out of his shock. Game? His voice was laced with frustration. What the hell is going on here? Dr. Stevens stepped into the room, shutting the door behind him. Yes, I also faked her abduction. Silence. Laura's head spun. You what? Blake looked between them, disbelief turning into quiet anger. You faked her abduction? Do you have any idea what we went through looking for her? What she put us through? Erin lowered her gaze, guilt flickering in her eyes, but Dr. Stevens continued unfazed. They already knew who and where she was, he explained. Erin was going to be the next victim, and there was no way to stop it. The only way to keep her alive was to make them believe she was already dead or missing. So, I made it happen before they could. Laura clenched her fists. And you didn't think to tell us? Dr. Stevens met her gaze. Would you have played along if I had? That stopped her. He sighed. Now that they think I'm dead, the risks are very low for all of us. But that only lasts as long as we stay one step ahead. We don't have the luxury of second-guessing anymore. Laura's jaw tightened, but she knew he was right. This wasn't just a conspiracy. It was a war being fought in the shadows. Dr. Stevens took a step closer. All you have to do now is execute my orders the way I say. If you have suggestions, you can let me know, and I will weigh them against what I know about the system. Laura and Blake exchanged glances before finally stepping toward Erin. They hugged her tightly, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had been through. Then, without another word, they left for Atlanta. The flight was tense. Laura stared out of the window, her mind racing with everything that had just happened. They had found Erin alive. Dr. Stevens also. And now, they had to convince Thomas Green to trust them before the real enemy realized they were still in the game. When they landed in Atlanta, a black SUV was waiting for them. Green's people were efficient, no questions, no wasted time. Laura, Blake, and Erin were ushered into a private meeting room at a discreet location downtown. Security was tight. Surveillance equipment had been disabled. No electronic devices were allowed inside. And then Thomas Green walked in. He was taller in person, his presence commanding. With sharp eyes and a measured expression, he studied them before sitting down. You have 5 minutes, he said. Laura wasted no time. She placed the flash drive on the table and slid it toward him. Everything you need to know is on there. Corruption, fraud, manipulation. The current administration is a front for something much worse. Green didn't reach for it. What is all this? Blake leaned forward. Your enemies are the same as ours. And if you don't act now, they'll get to you before you even get a chance to fight back. Green exhaled, then picked up the drive. I'll look into it. Laura shook her head. There's not much time to look into it. The state needs to be saved, and you're the right man for the job. We must act now. Green studied her. Laura? What is going on here? Laura hesitated before answering. I thought I was investigating corruption. Instead, I uncovered something so much bigger. Now, I don't have a choice. Green looked at them all once more before standing. If what's on this drive is real, we'll talk again soon. And with that, he left. Thomas Green sat at his desk, the glow of his desk lamp illuminating the screen of his laptop. The flash drive, innocuous in appearance, contained more than he had ever imagined. He clicked through folders labeled with vague names: Project Artemis, Evergreen Initiative, Consolidation Plans. Each one contained documents, spreadsheets, and correspondences that unraveled a web of deceit so intricate it left him breathless. As he scrolled through email exchanges, bank statements, and policy drafts riddled with loopholes, a sickening realization washed over him. This was not just corruption. It was systemic, deliberate, and ruthlessly executed. Politicians he once respected, business leaders he had shaken hands with, even members of his own party, complicit. He had always suspected a shadow government pulling the strings behind the scenes, but he had never been able to prove it. Now, the evidence was staring him in the face. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. Laura. She would know what to do. The phone rang twice before she answered. Thomas? Laura, I need to see you.
Now.
There was a brief pause before she responded. I understand. Where? The old press club. 20 minutes. The line went dead, and Thomas exhaled sharply. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. How had they gotten away with this for so long? How had no one exposed them? Or worse, had someone tried, only to be silenced? Blake and Laura arrived at the dimly lit club, their expressions grim but determined. Thomas stood near the bar, gripping a glass of water, like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice strained. Blake exchanged a glance with Laura before he pulled out his own tablet, bringing up detailed breakdowns of the documents. "It's worse than we thought," Blake started. "This isn't just bribery and backdoor deals, it's the wholesale auctioning of our government. Legislation has been crafted not to serve the people, but to consolidate power, funnel taxpayer money into private hands, and dismantle any opposition before it can even begin." Thomas swallowed hard. "I always suspected," he admitted, shaking his head. "I knew they were playing dirty, but this is an empire." Laura leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "And it's been built to last. Every time reformists like you come close to making real changes, they use their influence through media, through lobbying, through bureaucratic hurdles to make sure you fail. If they can't stop you, they discredit you. And if they can't discredit you," she let the implication hang in the air. Thomas clenched his fists. "Then how do we beat them?" he asked. "How do we take the system down?" Blake tapped the screen, pulling up another file. "Dr. Stevens has a strategy," he said. "We have to make this movement bigger than a campaign. We need a revolution." Laura took over. "You can't just expose corruption and expect people to rally behind you. This isn't just about what they've done, it's about what you're going to do. People need a vision, Thomas. They need to believe in something. That's where the Green Revolution comes in." Thomas frowned. "Revolution?" "Revolutions aren't just about tearing things down," Laura explained. "They're about rebuilding. And you have to show the people that you have the blueprint for something better." Blake nodded. "The electorate is disillusioned, but they're not stupid. They've seen politicians make promises and break them. If you want them to trust you, you have to redefine your movement, not as another political campaign, but as a true grassroots revolution. One where the people have a stake in their government again." Thomas exhaled, his mind already working through the possibilities. "And how do we do that?" Blake leaned forward. 3 steps. Educate, mobilize, execute. Educate. "The first step is information," Blake continued. "But not just dumping data onto the public. You have to make it digestible. People need to see exactly how this corruption affects their lives, how their wages are stagnant because of rigged policies, how their health care is a disaster because of corporate greed, how their small businesses are crushed under regulations that only apply to them, while the elite get tax loopholes the size of skyscrapers." Laura added, "And it can't just be you talking. We need a network, activists, whistleblowers, educators. This has to be a movement of the people, not just one man standing on a stage. Mobilize." "The second step," Blake said, "is boots on the ground. Protests, town halls, community meetings. We don't wait for the media to give us coverage. We create our own. Social media, independent journalism, viral content. If we control the narrative, they can't twist it." Laura smirked. "And most importantly, we organize at the local level. If we can create a network of trusted community leaders who can spread the message, we make it impossible for the establishment to shut us down." Thomas nodded, his heartbeat quickening. This was bigger than him. Bigger than just exposing corruption. Execute. "The final step," Blake said, "is action. This isn't just about winning an election, Thomas. It's about dismantling their entire infrastructure. That means passing real legislation that closes their loopholes. That means rewriting campaign finance laws. That means reshaping the economy so that it actually works for the people instead of a handful of billionaires. And that means," Laura said, "that you need to be ready for the fight of your life." Thomas looked at them both, his resolve hardening. "They've controlled the system for so long because no one has had the courage to challenge them," he said. "But that ends now." Blake smiled. "So, are we calling it the Green Revolution?" Thomas chuckled, the fire in his eyes unmistakable. "Damn right we are." The war for the state had just begun. The conference room buzzed with restless energy. The long mahogany table, usually reserved for political strategy meetings and policy discussions, was now the war room for the Green Revolution. Thomas sat at the head, his sharp gaze sweeping over his closest allies, Laura, Blake, and a dozen trusted lieutenants who had pledged themselves to the cause. The air was thick with tension, but also with anticipation. They were standing on the precipice of something historic, and every single person in the room knew that what they were about to do would change the trajectory of their state forever. Thomas leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "This is it," he said, his voice firm but steady. "We've talked about it, we've planned for it, but now it's real. We're officially launching the Green Revolution. From this moment on, we are no longer just politicians, activists, or strategists. We are revolutionaries." A murmur spread through the room. Some exchanged glances, others nodded with determination. Laura was the first to respond. "We've got the people on our side. We've got the message. But we need to be ready. The establishment will come for us harder than ever before." Blake nodded in agreement. They've built their empire on control of the media, control of the narrative, control of the law. The moment we go public, they're going to do everything they can to discredit us. We need a plan for when that happens. Thomas exhaled slowly. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but the weight of it all pressed against him. He wasn't just going up against corrupt politicians, he was going up against an entire system designed to protect itself. Still, there was no turning back now. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each person present. "We fight with truth," he said. "We fight with strategy. We fight with the people." The official launch was a masterfully planned event, designed to energize the people and shake the political establishment to its core. Held in the heart of the city, the rally brought together thousands of supporters, their voices a chorus of hope and defiance. Banners waved, signs bore the words "Green Revolution," "Power back to the people," and the air was electric with the energy of a movement that was bigger than any one person. Thomas stood on stage, the crowd before him stretching as far as he could see. Cameras flashed, and journalists lined the front row, eager for sound bites. He knew this was his moment, his chance to set the tone for the battle ahead. "My friends," he began, his voice booming through the speakers, "we stand at the edge of history. For too long, this state has been ruled by those who believe power belongs to the few. They have used their wealth, their influence, and their control of the system to silence us, to suppress us, to keep us from demanding what is rightfully ours. But today, we say no more." The crowd erupted in cheers. "They will try to smear us," he continued. "They will lie, they will manipulate, they will twist the truth. But we will not back down. Because this is not about me. This is about you, your families, your futures. This is about breaking the chains of corruption and restoring power to the people where it belongs." The energy was palpable. Thomas knew they had ignited something real. The Green Revolution had officially begun. It didn't take long for the counterattack to begin. Within hours of the rally, headlines flooded the news. "Green's dangerous populism," read one. "Green tied to radical activists," read another. A hit piece circulated online claiming Thomas had received illegal campaign donations from a shadowy foreign organization. Completely false, but damning nonetheless. The smear campaign escalated quickly. Anonymous sources, likely insiders planted by the opposition, leaked fabricated scandals, suggesting that Thomas had engaged in fraudulent business dealings years ago. They dug through his past, twisting harmless financial transactions into something nefarious. Suddenly, every major news network had an exclusive on Thomas Green's supposed misdeeds. "Unbelievable," Laura muttered as she scrolled through the latest smear article. "They're pulling out all the stops." "We knew they would," Thomas said, rubbing his temples. "But damn, they're fast." Blake paced the room. "This isn't just a media hit job. I got a call this morning, some of our donors are backing out. They're afraid of being blacklisted." Thomas clenched his fists. He expected attacks, but this was an all-out assault. The establishment wasn't just trying to discredit him, they were trying to bury him before he could gain momentum. But the Green Revolution was built to withstand attacks. Laura and Blake quickly devised a strategy to counter the smears. Every false allegation was met with cold, hard facts. When the media accused Thomas of financial misconduct, his team released full financial records proving otherwise. When they tried to paint him as a radical, his supporters flooded social media with testimonials about his integrity. And then, the campaign struck back with its own narrative. Why are they so afraid of Thomas Green? The message resonated. The harder the establishment tried to silence him, the more people began to ask, were they hiding? The revolution also took an unexpected turn. Citizen journalists and independent media outlets began covering the story from a different perspective. They exposed the tactics being used against Thomas, revealing connections between the smear campaigns and the very corporations he had vowed to dismantle. The attempt to destroy his reputation was backfiring. They thought they could control the narrative, Blake said with a smirk. Turns out the people aren't buying it. Thomas exhaled, feeling the weight on his shoulders lessen, just slightly. Then we keep pushing forward, he said. This was just the first battle. The war is far from over. Despite the opposition's relentless attacks, the movement continued to grow. People saw through the lies, and instead of diminishing, Thomas's support base expanded. Town halls were packed. Volunteer numbers surged. Donations from small contributors poured in, counteracting the loss of corporate backers. The revolution had taken its first hit, but it had survived. More than that, it had proven that it would not be easily crushed. The establishment had underestimated the resilience of the people. As Thomas looked out over his growing movement, he knew that the battles ahead would only get harder. But something deep inside him told him they were on the right path. The Green Revolution had survived its first test. The revolution was growing, but with that growth came new challenges. Thomas Green had always known that fighting corruption meant more than just exposing it. It meant outmaneuvering those who benefited from it. The enemy wasn't just the establishment, but also the shadows within his own ranks. He needed allies, true believers, people who weren't just looking for power but were willing to fight for real change. The question was, who could he trust? Thomas sat in the back room of a small diner, the kind of place where political deals were made far from cameras and prying ears. Across from him sat Senator Miriam Caldwell, a seasoned politician who had built her career on a reputation for integrity, though she had never openly defied the power brokers that ruled the state. She was pragmatic, careful, and, until now, unwilling to step too far outside the system. "I won't lie to you, Thomas," Caldwell said, stirring a cup of coffee. "I admire what you're trying to do, but you're making enemies fast. The kind of enemies who don't just ruin careers, they ruin lives." Thomas leaned in. "I know what I'm up against. But I also know that you didn't get into politics just to watch the state be sold to the highest bidder." Caldwell sighed. "There was a time when I believed we could fix things from the inside. But every time I tried, It's clear, Thomas. Real change isn't allowed." She looked up at him, her gaze sharp. "If I stand with you, they'll come after me too. Are you ready for that?" Thomas nodded. "I don't need you to risk everything." "Not yet. But when the moment comes, when the people demand change, I need to know that you won't stand in the way." Caldwell was silent for a long time before finally nodding. "When that time comes, you'll have my support." One down. Many more to go. Blake had spent weeks reaching out to activists, organizers, and reformers, people who had spent years fighting the system in their own way but had never had a true leader to rally behind. Slowly, alliances began forming. There was Devin Hayes, a labor organizer who had been exposing corporate corruption long before the Green Revolution began. He brought with him thousands of workers who were ready to mobilize. Then there was Elena Martinez, a former investigative journalist who had lost her career after uncovering bribery at the highest levels. She had the ability to control the narrative in independent media, countering the establishment's propaganda. Even more surprising was Edward Langston, a member of the opposing party, who had privately expressed frustration at how his own leadership had been manipulated by the same corporate interests Thomas was fighting. He wouldn't publicly support the revolution yet, but he made it clear that he wouldn't stand in the way. Piece by piece, the network was growing. But for every new ally, a new enemy emerged. Thomas had always known there were those in his own party who secretly worked for the opposition, but now that the revolution was gaining ground, they were becoming more aggressive. One of them was Senator Robert Halston, a longtime colleague who had always been friendly with Thomas. Too friendly. For weeks, Halston had pretended to be on board with the revolution, but Laura had caught wind of something troubling. "He's leaking information," she told Thomas one evening as they reviewed internal communications. "Every time we plan an event, they counter it. Every attack we prepare for, they're one step ahead. Someone is feeding them our strategy." Blake crossed his arms. "And we know exactly who it is." They had intercepted an email. Halston had been sending reports to a lobbyist known for working with the most corrupt interests in the state. He was the inside man, the one making sure the establishment stayed ahead of them. Thomas felt a wave of anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We can't expose him yet. If we do, they'll just replace him with someone else. We need to feed him false information. Let him think he's still one step ahead, until it's too late." Blake smirked. "Now you're thinking like them." Of all the unlikely allies, the most unexpected came in the form of Dr. Stevens, once one of the masterminds behind the system's propaganda machine, now a ghost operating from exile. Stevens had built his career engineering narratives, designing language that could manipulate the masses. He had spent years working for the corrupt elite, helping them shape public perception, control elections, and suppress opposition. He had once been an enemy of the people, but now he wanted redemption. In a secure communication channel known only to Thomas, Blake, and Laura, Stevens's voice crackled through the speakers. "I've spent my life using words as weapons," Stevens said. "For years, I manipulated people into thinking the decisions they were making were theirs by just a combination of colors, shapes, and words. I was good at it." Thomas listened carefully, waiting for the catch. "And now you want to use those skills for us?" "For the people," Stevens corrected. "I spent my life crafting illusions. Now it is time to dismantle them." It had been months since anyone had seen Dr. Stevens. Officially, he was dead, a casualty of a supposed poisoning, but the truth was, he had fled. He had seen the monster he helped create and had chosen to disappear rather than be part of it any longer. Now, from a hidden location in a foreign country, he was offering Thomas the very expertise that had once been used to manipulate the people. He was the invisible hand guiding the revolution's messaging, crafting speeches, slogans, and strategies that would resonate with the public in ways the opposition could never anticipate. "They control the media," Stevens said. "They control the narrative. But I know their tricks. I know how to make them panic. And when people start to see through their illusions, the whole system will crack." With allies gathering and enemies closing in, Thomas knew that the fight was about to escalate. He could feel the momentum shifting. His revolution was no longer just an idea, it was a force that couldn't be ignored. But the establishment was watching, waiting, and soon, they would strike back harder than ever before. This was more than a political battle. It was a war. The establishment had underestimated the Green Revolution. At first, they dismissed it as another fleeting populist movement, something that would burn bright for a moment before fading away. But now, as the crowds grew, as the polls shifted, and as once loyal politicians began wavering in their allegiances, they knew they had to crush it. And they were willing to do whatever it took. The first attack came where it always did: money. Thomas's campaign had been running on small-dollar donations from the people, but every political movement needed basic resources: venues for rallies, transportation for organizers, security for events. And suddenly, it all became impossible. Banks started freezing accounts linked to the campaign, citing vague compliance concerns. Venues mysteriously canceled last minute, claiming unforeseen circumstances. Even vendors who had previously worked with the campaign backed out, some with quiet apologies, others too afraid to even pick up the phone. "They're cutting off our supply lines," Blake growled, slamming his laptop shut. "We can't book spaces. We can't move money. We can't even print damn flyers without someone pulling the plug." Laura looked at Thomas, her expression tense. "This isn't just business pressure. This is coordinated." Thomas nodded grimly. "They're making an example of us." But they wouldn't back down. If the traditional system wouldn't let them campaign, they'd find a new way. So they went underground. They turned to community spaces, private homes, churches, and warehouses. People opened their homes and businesses for organizing. Local print shops, the kind not tied to major corporate chains, started producing materials on the down low. And when social media companies started throttling their content, limiting their reach with algorithm changes, they turned to peer-to-peer networks. Supporters shared videos through encrypted group chats, community message boards, and direct text chains. If the establishment thought they could choke the revolution into submission, they were wrong. Because this wasn't just a campaign anymore, it was a resistance. When money wasn't enough to kill the movement, the establishment turned to the law. Or rather, they weaponized it. Lawsuits flooded in overnight. Allegations of financial misconduct, fabricated tax violations, and accusations of campaign fraud were filed against Thomas and his closest allies. At a press conference, the Attorney General, one of the establishment's most loyal enforcers, stood before the cameras, a self-righteous scowl on his face. "We are launching a full investigation into the financial dealings of the so-called Green Revolution," he announced. Transparency and accountability apply to everyone, even those who claim to fight for the people. Thomas watched the press conference from a war room deep inside their headquarters. Laura paced back and forth, furious. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "They know we're clean." "That's not the point," Blake said bitterly. "They don't need to prove anything. They just need to make it look like we're corrupt." Thomas exhaled slowly. He had expected this. The establishment always used the law as a weapon, not to find the truth, but to create enough doubt to make people question everything. "Fine," he said finally. "Then we go public first. Full transparency. We release every donation record, every campaign expense, every document. We own our truth before they can twist it." And that's exactly what they did. Within hours, Thomas's team published everything online. While the establishment relied on vague accusations, the Green Revolution responded with cold, hard facts. And the people? They saw through the game. When the establishment realized they couldn't block the movement, couldn't discredit it, couldn't starve it, they got personal. It started with whispers. Laura received anonymous emails with threats against her family. Blake found a tracker hidden under his car. And then one night, Thomas got the call. His brother, Daniel, a high school teacher who had stayed out of politics, was pulled over and arrested on a bogus drug charge. Thomas arrived at the police station, his heart pounding with fury. He found Daniel sitting in a holding cell, bruised and shaken. "They planted it," Daniel muttered. "I swear, Thomas, they—" "I know," Thomas interrupted, his voice tight with barely restrained rage. "They're sending a message." Daniel's arrest made headlines. The media, complicit as ever, ran the story as if it were legitimate, plastering his mugshot across every screen. The implication was clear. If Thomas didn't back down, they would go after his family. That night, Thomas sat alone in his office, fists clenched, his mind racing. This was the moment they wanted. They wanted him to be afraid. They wanted him to hesitate. They wanted him to lose control. And for the first time, he felt the weight of it all. Was he willing to let his family suffer for this fight? Was it worth it? Then, as if on cue, his phone vibrated. A new video had gone viral, not from his team, but from the people. It was footage of an old man at a rally, voice shaking with anger, shouting at a reporter. "They can arrest his brother. They can shut down his accounts. They can smear his name, but we're still here. They can't arrest all of us. They can't stop all of us. We are the revolution." Tears burned at the corners of Thomas's eyes as he watched. This fight was bigger than him, bigger than his family, bigger than any one person. This was a battle for the soul of the people. And if the establishment thought they could break him, they were dead wrong. The next morning, Thomas stood before a roaring crowd, unshaken. He held up his brother's mugshot for everyone to see. "This," he said, "is what they do when they're afraid." The crowd exploded in fury and determination. "They want us silent," Thomas continued. "They want us to be afraid. But listen to me, we are not afraid." The chant started in the back. "We are not afraid. We are not afraid." It spread like wildfire, rolling across the crowd, shaking the ground beneath them. Thomas raised his fist in the air. "They want to fight," he shouted. "Then we'll give them one." And that was the moment the establishment realized their mistake. Because they hadn't just tried to kill the revolution. They had made it unstoppable. The moment had arrived. For months, the Green Revolution had fought tooth and nail against the establishment. They had survived smear campaigns, financial sabotage, legal warfare, and even personal threats.
But none of it mattered now.
Because this was the final stand. And Thomas Green knew that if he didn't break the system tonight, the system would break him. The stage was set. A high-profile, nationally televised debate between Thomas Green and Governor Elena Rivers. The establishment had tried to block him from getting this moment, but the movement had grown too powerful to be ignored.
The people demanded it.
The crowd was electric, split between die-hard loyalists of the governor and the fiery supporters of the revolution. Tension filled the air. The moderator, a stiff-looking corporate media figure, adjusted his glasses and turned to Thomas. Mr. Green, your campaign has relied on rhetoric about corruption, but many would say you haven't provided solid proof. Do you have any real evidence? Thomas leaned forward. The entire state was watching. I thought you'd never ask. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small black flash drive, the same one that had started everything. He held it up for the cameras. This, he said, his voice unwavering, contains hard evidence of widespread corruption by Governor Rivers and her inner circle. Bank statements. Shell company transactions. Direct proof of government contracts being awarded to businesses that don't even exist. The governor's face remained impassive, but her fingers clenched against the podium. I have spent months uncovering this, Thomas continued, and tonight, I'm making it public. With a practice motion, he pressed a button on his tablet. Screens behind him lit up with documents, emails, and signed orders, all linking Elena Rivers to a tangled web of fraud and theft. Gasps erupted from the audience. The debate moderator's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. And then, the screen went black. The television feed cut off. The cameras, the microphones, everything shut down. For a brief moment, silence reigned. Then chaos. People screamed. Protesters surged forward. The establishment had just proven their own corruption in real time. They were so terrified of the truth that they killed their own broadcast. And that was the final straw. Words spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with rage. The debate had been cut off, but people had already seen enough. Within hours, millions mobilized. By morning, 2 million citizens had taken to the streets. The largest march in the state's history. From every town, every city, they came. Farmers, factory workers, teachers, students, families. The people had had enough. Chants echoed through the streets. Down with Rivers. Down with corruption. We want justice. We want truth. Green Revolution. Green Revolution. Outside the state parliament and state house, the crowd surged forward, unrelenting. Police forces, normally deployed to crush dissent, hesitated. Some even removed their riot gear and joined the march. Inside the state house, Governor Rivers and her allies were in full panic. They had thought they could control the narrative. They had thought their power was absolute. But they had never faced the raw, unstoppable force of millions of people demanding justice. Governor Rivers stood in her office, watching the mass of people outside the gates. The noise was deafening. Her phone buzzed, another cabinet member resigning, another judge distancing themselves, another corporation pulling out of a deal. She had lost. An hour later, she appeared on a hastily arranged press conference. Her face was pale, her voice hollow. I am officially stepping down as governor of the state. The streets erupted in celebration. The corrupt had fallen. With Rivers gone, a transitional government was sworn in within hours. No time for backroom deals, no time for manipulation. A new election date was announced immediately. And the Green Revolution had one final mission. Not just to win, but to rebuild everything from the ground up. This wasn't just a campaign anymore. It was the birth of a new era. The celebrations had barely died down before the first cracks in the new order appeared. For weeks, the Green Revolution had been riding on a wave of triumph. Governor Elena Rivers was gone, The people had reclaimed their power, and a transitional government was in place to oversee free and fair elections. It was supposed to be over. But Thomas Green had spent enough time fighting the establishment to know one thing: they never truly surrender. The transitional government moved fast. They spoke the language of reform, promising transparency and accountability. Their press conferences were filled with the right words: justice, fairness, democracy. The people believed them. Thomas wanted to believe them. And yet, something didn't feel right. At first, it was small things: officials refusing to meet with Green's team, delays in confirming election dates, minor bureaucratic roadblocks that seemed too convenient. Then, one morning, Blake stormed into Thomas's office, eyes burning with fury. "They played us." Thomas put down his coffee. "What do you mean?" Blake slammed a folder onto the desk. The entire transitional government, they were handpicked by the establishment. Every single one of them has ties to the old regime. Rivers might be gone, but the system? It's still in control. Thomas's stomach turned cold. "That's impossible. The people chose them." "No," Blake said, shaking his head. "They let the people think they chose them." Laura, standing in the corner, spoke softly. "They knew they were losing power, Thomas. So they did what they do best. They rigged the game before we even knew we were playing." Days later, the final betrayal came. The transitional government officially suspended the elections. They cited legal complexities and the need for stability before a democratic transition. It was all legal, a loophole buried deep in the state's emergency governance laws, one that no one had noticed before. They had been waiting for this moment. And now the state was stuck. No elections. No clear leadership. No way forward. The Green Revolution had been outmaneuvered. The backlash was immediate. The very same 2 million citizens who had marched to overthrow Governor Rivers now took to the streets again. Chants of "We want elections" and "Democracy now" filled the air. But this time, the response was different. The transitional government, unlike Rivers, had learned from the past. They didn't send police to violently crack down. They ignored the protests. No tear gas. No riot shields. No dramatic arrests. Just silence. And the silence was deafening. Because without official elections, the protests had no power. There was no corrupt governor to bring down, no obvious villain to unseat. The system wasn't being held by one person anymore. It was held by paperwork, bureaucracy, and legal loopholes. This wasn't a dictatorship with a face. It was a dictatorship of process. And that made it even more dangerous. Thomas sat in the war room, hands clasped, listening as Laura argued with a constitutional lawyer over the phone. "There's got to be a way around this," she snapped. The lawyer sighed. "The only entity with the power to override this is the federal government." The room fell silent. Blake exhaled. "So, we have to call in the feds." Thomas rubbed his temples.
He knew what that meant.
If they asked for federal intervention, it wouldn't just be about state politics anymore. The entire country would be watching. And the federal government? They wouldn't just send monitors. They would send judges, investigations, and if things escalated, troops. Would it fix the system? Or would it turn the state into a battleground? Thomas looked at his team. The people had trusted him to bring change. And now, the revolution was at its most dangerous crossroads. Would he call for federal intervention, risking escalation and the loss of state autonomy? Or would he try to fight this battle from within, knowing the system was rigged against him? Either way, the next move would define everything. Victory or defeat. Dr. Stevens knew better. And just then his call comes in. The celebrations had barely died down before the first cracks in the new order appeared. For weeks, the Green Revolution had been riding on a wave of triumph. Governor Elena Rivers was gone, the people had reclaimed their power, and a transitional government was in place to oversee free and fair elections. It was supposed to be over. But Thomas Green had spent enough time fighting the establishment to know one thing: they never truly surrender. The transitional government moved fast. They spoke the language of reform, promising transparency and accountability. Their press conferences were filled with the right words: justice, fairness, democracy. The people believed them. Thomas wanted to believe them. And yet, something didn't feel right. At first, it was small things, officials refusing to meet with Green's team, delays in confirming election dates, minor bureaucratic roadblocks that seemed too convenient. Then, one morning, Blake stormed into Thomas's office, eyes burning with fury. They played us. Thomas put down his coffee. What do you mean? Blake slammed a folder onto the desk. The entire transitional government, they were handpicked by the establishment. Every single one of them has ties to the old regime. Rivers might be gone, but the system? It's still in control. Thomas's stomach turned cold. That's impossible. The people chose them. No, Blake said, shaking his head. They let the people think they chose them. Laura, standing in the corner, spoke softly. They knew they were losing power, Thomas. So they did what they do best. They rigged the game before we even knew we were playing. Days later, the final betrayal came. The transitional government officially suspended the elections. They cited legal complexities and the need for stability before a democratic transition. It was all legal, a loophole buried deep in the state's emergency governance laws, one that no one had noticed before. They had been waiting for this moment, and now the state was stuck. No elections, no clear leadership, no way forward. The Green Revolution had been outmaneuvered. The backlash was immediate. The very same 2 million citizens who had marched to overthrow Governor Rivers now took to the streets again. Chants of "We want elections" and "Democracy now" filled the air. But this time, the response was different. The transitional government, unlike Rivers, had learned from the past. They didn't send police to violently crack down. They ignored the protests. No tear gas. No riot shields. No dramatic arrests. Just silence. And the silence was deafening. Because without official elections, the protests had no power. There was no corrupt governor to bring down, no obvious villain to unseat. The system wasn't being held by one person anymore. It was held by paperwork, bureaucracy, and legal loopholes. This wasn't a dictatorship with a face. It was a dictatorship of process. And that made it even more dangerous. Thomas sat in the war room, hands clasped, listening as Laura argued with a constitutional lawyer over the phone. There's got to be a way around this, she snapped. The lawyer sighed. The only entity with the power to override this is the federal government. The room fell silent. Blake exhaled. So, we have to call in the feds. Thomas rubbed his temples.
He knew what that meant.
If they asked for federal intervention, it wouldn't just be about state politics anymore. The entire country would be watching. And the federal government? They wouldn't just send monitors. They would send judges, investigations, and if things escalated, troops. Would it fix the system? Or would it turn the state into a battleground? Thomas looked at his team. The people had trusted him to bring change. And now, the revolution was at its most dangerous crossroads. Would he call for federal intervention, risking escalation and the loss of state autonomy? Or would he try to fight this battle from within, knowing the system was rigged against him? Either way, the next move would define everything. Victory or defeat. Dr. Stevens knew better. And just then his call comes in. The story continues in part 3. Don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts. Subscribe to stay updated on the next chapter.